I'm Jim Halfpenny, and I welcome you to a gathering of naturalists. The gathering is hosted by Naturalist World, an ecological education company located at the north entrance to Yellowstone National Park. Our company sponsors educational programs and research in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We also host this free lecture series, which highlights the knowledge and expertise of those who live, study, and love the ecosystem. Gathering a Naturalist, a series of lectures provided by experts on topics ranging from archaeology to geology to natural history to history and more, and archived for all to enjoy on our YouTube channel, Gathering a Naturalist. Please join me now for our program.
Thought about it and mulled it over for a while, and it was one of those things that I just couldn't forget about. Just one thing about this cover, I really love the cover of this book. This is an actual photograph from like the early 1900s that's been colorized. And this is a glacier in France, the Mer de Glace. I'm butchering that name because there's a lot of foreign words in my book that I butchered when I say them out loud. But this is an actual photograph, and people in the Victorian era women in their big hoop skirts used to go and travel across these glaciers with guides, and they would take them up and down the ice, grand old time, and it kind of was the start of tourism in that area. Now, if you've ever been there, it's a pretty busy place. Well, you can go walk on the glacier, but you have to have a guide. So this is Craig Lee here, and the object that he had found, the foreshaft of an atlatl. Atlatls are a specialized hunting tool that were used in terms of time, the spear, which is just a big, long tool with a point on one end, and the bow and arrow. The way that this tool works is it's really cool. You have a 3-foot long dart at the business end of an atlatl, and it fits into a groove or a notch into something called a throwing board. And the addition of the throwing board increases the leverage of your arm so that when you're throwing the weapon, you can throw it a lot farther and faster than you would just using your arm alone. And you can imagine that if you're a hunter from many thousands of years ago, that would be really important for you to be able to throw far and fast. You don't want to have to get too close to some of these animals that you're trying to harvest. This is an illustration I had done, and it didn't actually end up, we didn't do illustrations in my book, which I kind of regret, but I just loved her drawing of it, so I thought I would include it. Craig Lee was in the Beartooth Mountains when he found this artifact, and he was walking along the edge of an ice patch, and he was 10,000 feet above elevation, above tree line, so there's no trees there, and he was wondering, how does a piece of wood get to a place 10,000 feet above sea level? You or I would be looking at something like this and think, well, it's just a broken piece of wood. I really, even though I've been looking and researching about ice patch archaeology artifacts for a couple of years, would never look at something like this and think, wow, that's an incredible find. But he saw something because he's trained to see these kinds of things that you or I may not be able to see. He took a small sample of it and sent it off to a lab for radiocarbon dating, and it came back with a date of 10,300 years old. And it is the oldest ice patch artifact ever to have been found, still to this date. And he found it back in 2007, 2008. So it's a pretty remarkable find. When I read that, I thought, wow, that's just like such an amazing discovery. I set a Google alert as nerds do, for more information. Are there other people finding artifacts like this? What are people interested in? Are people writing about this sort of thing? Because I was kind of thinking in my mind that it could potentially be a good book. But as an ornithologist, you might say, well, why go from ornithology, from studying birds, to archaeology? Those are really two different things. And I am interested in the human relationship to our environment. We are products of the environment. We are just another species on this planet, and we have been influenced over 350,000 years of humans, anatomically modern humans, like someone you would recognize as another person walking down the street. We've been around for several 100,000 years. We are products of our environment, but I'm also interested in how we also shape our environment in turn. And ice patch archaeology is a nice amalgamation of those concepts, because it rose directly out of our climate crisis. As these bodies of ice melt high in the alpine environments, objects that had lain frozen beneath the surface for many hundreds or even thousands of years are beginning to emerge. Because this is a discipline that arose directly out of our climate crisis, we can learn about not only what the ice tells us about our future and what will happen if we lose all of our ice, but it can also tell us a little bit about our past. So most of you have probably seen this figure. It is an illustration of the carbon dioxide fluctuation over the last 800,000 years. Basically, when carbon dioxide is high, we're in a warmer period. When it's low, we're in an ice age. Anatomically, modern humans came around somewhere around here, but our human lineage arose sometime between 6 and 8 million years ago. So, but anatomically modern humans. So if you're looking at our history, we have lived through these ebbs and flows of climate. Climate has sometimes been warm, sometimes been cold. We are adapted to those variations in climate. What we see though, as you go to this part, is that we're kind of going off the charts here. So we're at, current year right now, carbon dioxide is just totally off the charts. And about 1950, we surpassed the pre-industrial carbon dioxide concentration of about 300 parts per million, and it's just been increasing ever since. And it takes a little bit of time for glaciers to catch up to that climate warming. And so we really started seeing, or scientists started seeing, visible glacier melt, measurable glacier melt sometime around 1970. And every year since then, glaciers have been losing ice rather than gaining ice. Given the current levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, half of all mountain glaciers are expected to disappear by 2100. So that's only about 75 years. If we continue down our current path, and there's no reason to say that we're not changing anything that we're doing, we're headed for about a 5-degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature by 2100. With that level of warming, all the glaciers in the Alps will disappear, these mid-latitude glaciers. And you can see this time series here already. It's very visible, that you can look at all the carbon dioxide fluctuations, but nothing brings it home more than looking at a repeat photograph of glaciers actually melting. All the glaciers in New Zealand will disappear, and so will they in the North American Rockies. We know why it's important that our glaciers don't melt, right? We depend on mountain snowpack and meltwater from bodies of ice that accumulate snow over the winter to sustain us, to sustain not only the water we drink every single day, but agriculture. People who live far from mountains, not Oklahoma, are still dependent on that glacial meltwater to irrigate their fields and irrigate their crops. So obviously we know that it's really important, but we've talked, glaciologists have talked, earth scientists have talked about ice, just climate change and what it is that we're losing if these bodies of ice melt. But the human element really hasn't come into play. One of the reasons why I love ice patch archaeology so much is because it brings in human glacier melt in terms of what's happening now and what will happen in the future, but the melt effects that are past too, and how we relate to all of these bodies of ice, these glaciers and these snow patches. How did it start, this field of ice patch archaeology? Well, in 1991, it was a very hot summer in the Alps. There had been some Saharan dust storm over the winter, and this is pretty common in Europe. It's becoming more and more common with climate change. This wind patterns carried all of this dust over to the Alps and deposited kind of this thin layer of soot on the glaciers. That, coupled with extremely warm temperatures, meant that the ice was really melting quite fast in the Alps during the early 90s. It made for some kind of treacherous conditions out there, but there was a couple, Erica and Helmut Simon, who were pretty adventurous, and that's their little picture there. And I just love looking at their matching outfits. They had a good time. So they had visited this area. It's called the Utzal Alps, and the Utzal Alps are a rugged mountain range that form the border between Italy and Austria. So you can actually go from one to the other. The Alpine Ridge is the border of those two countries. They had visited in the 80s and they loved it so much that they decided to come back and do a second tour. Well, they had climbed an 11,000 foot 500 mountain foot mountain. They were off trail and they were looking for a trail marker to get them back onto the trail. Now, I've hiked in this area and it is no joke. It is actually quite scary to hike in some of these places. Very rocky, very loose. You leave the trail or go off trail, it can get dangerous pretty quickly. So they were looking really to get back on the trail. They thought they had seen a mark sticking up out of the snow. So they decided to head toward it. And when they got there, they realized that no, it's not a marker, it's actually a person that's buried in the snow. And so I just want to warn everyone, there is a body coming up. So if you don't want to see it, close your eyes. This is the last photo in their film camera that they took, one of the last photos of this body. This is the first photo of this person that they had found. They were pretty disturbed by it. It was unnerving to go into the mountains and see something like this. But the alpine recovery teams weren't all that surprised. It had been, like I said, a very warm summer. This was, I think, the 6th body to have melted out of the glaciers that summer. So it was a big year, but most of those bodies, it was a big year for them. Most of those bodies were torn to pieces because they had been inside a glacier rather than an ice patch. And I'll get to that distinction in a minute. And so when they come and look at this body, they thought, well, he must have been some poor hiker who had just met an unfortunate end. Every year people die in the Alps. They fall into crevasses, they break an ankle, die of exposure. We all know, been in the mountains and how easy something like this can happen. So as the recovery team was trying to extract this person, they were hacking away at his body. They weren't really all that careful and they destroyed some really important and critical evidence, but fortunately most of it made it down. So they brought the body down to University Hospital in Austria, and the undertaker was busy, looking at him, trying to figure out what his cause of death was. And he noticed that this man was wearing some leather shoes, and they were stuffed with grass, and then they were tied together with string or like rope. Wasn't sure. He had also been wearing some leather trousers. Most of that had fallen off of his body, but he came down with this bag full of that the recovery team had stuffed full of all of his belongings. And there was a stone dagger. And there was an axe, not like the ones you might, use today if you're ice climbing, but something that looked so old. He thought, well, I think this is the case for an archaeologist. I'm not sure I should be really touching this body any more than I have to. Luckily, was an archaeological division at the university. And so he called up the archaeologist, Conrad Spindler, and asked him to come over and help him kind of figure out what this body was, because they were trying to decide how old he was. So the flint tools hinted at the Neolithic, but Spindler noticed that the axe dated to the early Bronze Age. He'd never seen a completely intact axe preserved with its finding and handle. No archaeologist had. Most often the wood and bindings decomposed quickly from exposure. Only a few axe heads had been found with their handles, but never attached to them. The axe handle or haft was 2 feet long, made of a single piece of wood cut from a yew tree and shaped like an L. The L was a branch that had grown out of a trunk and was cut while the tree was still alive. The blade of the axe head was less than 4 inches long and was covered in a thin ochre patina from prolonged exposure to water. It was wedged into a notch in the haft on the short end of the L and bound with leather cord. A scratch mark in the blade exposed a thin line of pinkish orange metal. Spindler wasn't sure whether it was copper or bronze. All was quiet in the exam room, save for a clock ticking on the wall. Unterdorfer, the undertaker, and Hen, head of the undertaker's office, I don't know what you call that, but after some moments, Spindler spoke. The body is about 4,000 years old. He followed up more quietly with, and if the dating is revised, it will be even earlier. This just was spectacular for them because they just wondered how could such an old body, 4,000 years old, be preserved in the ice for all those years and never have been found or, had emerged before. Well, so the first thing that Spindler did was take a few samples of the body and a few samples of the clothing and the tools that he came off the mountain with, because he wanted to well, first of all, just get a date on all of them, but a similar date between the tools and the body would allow him to infer that they probably belong together. And when he got the results back from the lab, it turned out that this mummy was 5,300 years old. Yeah, so it's a pretty old corpse. So initially, everyone thought that he'd been found melting out of a glacier, but he'd actually been found melting out of an ice patch. And the distinction between those two is really important because glaciers, as you know, accumulate, mountain glaciers I'll talk about, accumulate snow and ice up high where it's super cold. They flow down a mountain due to pressure and gravity. When they reach those lower elevations in summer months, it's warmer than freezing, so some of that ice is melting. This means that the ice within glaciers isn't more than about 500 years old. That's about the oldest ice you're going to get in a glacier. And it's because it's constantly renewed. It's just like a conveyor belt. So anything that's buried in the ice is only going to be about 500 years old at most. And it's being carried down the mountain. And that's the other fact that makes glaciers not very good at preserving artifacts, is the fact that it's constantly moving, which means that anything that falls into a crevasse or is left on top of a glacier is crushed as it makes its way down the mountain. Ice patches, on the other hand, tend to occur on shallow slopes, so they don't get as big as ice patches from where they occur. That makes them really stable. So because ice patches don't move all that much, there's a little bit of movement in there. They're really good at preserving artifacts. So anything that falls on top of an ice patch gets covered in snow and it's preserved in its original state for the most part, including, and this is one of the cruxes of ice patch archaeology, organic artifacts. So things that don't typically show up in the archaeological record. So archaeologists are used to finding stones and bones and things that are really hard and last a long time, but we don't often see these things other things that we might use in our everyday lives. Clothing, wooden tools, figurines, things that just sinew to tie things together, things that would normally decay in a few years if left exposed to sunlight and wind are able to be preserved because the ice is, you sure you guys have mystery foods in your freezer you forgot to label. I know I do, and they're just gonna be preserved for thousands of years. So it could be an artifact one day. So that's the big distinction between ice patches and glaciers, and why ice patches are so good at preserving this organic material in its original state. And because ice patches are not moving, the ice inside gets really old. So the artifact, the atlatl that Craig Lee found, 10,300 years old, the ice is 10,300 years old. So, and the ice, for this ice patch that the mummy came out of, Utsi, is 5,300 years old at least, right? So for there to have been an object preserved in the ice for that long, the ice must have been there right away or pretty soon after, and stayed that way, frozen for many thousands of years. And the only reason people, archaeologists or hikers, if you're the helmets, are finding these things is because the ice is melting. We would never know about this phenomenon of ice patches and what brought people to these ice patches if it weren't for climate change. So while scientists were busy studying every aspect of Utsi, like everything, other objects began melting out of the ice. So I like to think of Utsi as the starting gun for ice patch archaeology, but he is not the first ice patch artifact. If we travel to Norway, we learn that in the 1960s, there was an archaeologist, Barbred, who was really interested in this whole collection of artifacts that had been found along the edges of ice patches for a couple of decades earlier. I think the earliest artifact was from 1914. Most of these objects are arrows, Viking age spears and things like that. And he really just kind of put together this collection, a little story of this collection, and he published in some niche journals in Norway, but it really never made it outside of Norway. This was like not very widely known other than, just in that country. And so people elsewhere were just unaware that this phenomenon was happening, and to their knowledge, it wasn't happening anywhere else. So it seemed like kind of a unique thing. Then in the early 2000s, started really melting in Norway, and we got some really, really warm summers. In Norway, it's really interesting because they have a whole cadre of amateur archaeologists who are just out there kind of looking for stuff. A lot of them are reindeer herders, and so they're out looking for artifacts while they're herding their reindeer. So this is the Yellowstone ice patch in south central Norway. It's located just outside of Jotunheimen National Park. It's a beautiful place. The park is home to the highest peak in Norway and all of Scandinavia, in fact, and it's only about 8,100 feet. I climbed it and it was a difficult one. I mean, it's surprisingly so for only being 8,100 feet. So he found a couple of sticks with some flags attached to one end. So, he didn't really know what to make of that, but he called a local archaeologist and was like, hey, could you maybe come take a look at this? I found something neat near an ice patch. And so they did, and they came out and they found all of these stone hunting blinds. A little bit difficult to see here, washed out, but you can see that there is obviously a made structure right in here, and it's a stone structure. It's obviously had been put there. It wasn't moved around by the glaciers or by the ice. They also found some spears, wooden spears that were still attached to their iron or stone points. They wondered, as they were visiting this ice patch, and they found hundreds and hundreds of these strange sticks with little flags on one end. How did it all fit together? How does the ice patch, these hunting tools and the stone blinds fit? Do they tell a story? And what they realized is that reindeer, to escape biting flies and botflies and insects and other pests during summer, will seek out ice patches and kind of loaf on them during the summer months when it's super hot. They're very reluctant to leave, and they just kind of hang out on these ice patches. All of this dark stuff is reindeer dung. It is buried in the ice, and there's layers and layers and layers of it. And if you look inside this particular ice patch, in fact, I think it's the Yellowstone ice patch, they have excavated a tunnel inside the ice patch. So you can actually go inside it and walk around, which is really a unique experience. And they have put some of the artifacts that had melted out of this ice patch, replicas, embedded in windows of ice, like you were discovering it yourself. It's a really fun place, and I highly recommend going if you ever get the chance to be up there. Smell the reindeer dung, the stale ice in this ice patch, and I could see the layers of reindeer dung bounded by layers of ice, and it was just one on top of the other. What they learned is that these strange sticks, a drawing of one here on the right-hand side, were used to scare the reindeer. When you're up above tree line, reindeer aren't really used to seeing things that are above the ground level, so they get a little bit scared from it. And so with these sticks, with either a fabric or a light piece of wood on one end, and it's super windy up there, so they would wave in the wind, and the reindeer would freak out and go in a certain direction that they had already pre-planned. They were driving them toward hunters waiting behind these stone blinds, and then they would harvest the reindeer. So it's just like this whole hunting story up in the mountains there. So some of these finds in Norway, they have now, I think they have like 50 ice patches that they're surveying. They have collected thousands and thousands of artifacts, mostly related to reindeer hunting, but they've also encountered some really neat other things. This is a ski. I can't even imagine skiing on something that big, but these skis with wooden skis with bindings, leather bindings, and then they would line the underside of the ski with reindeer fur, and they would act like skins. I mean, they're skins, literal skins. And so as they were skiing up the mountains, they'd put the reindeer fur in the right direction so that they would glide uphill, but then, have traction from sliding back down. And they have found some of the oldest intact skis in the world. And Norwegians are very proud of their skiing history. And so they really want to they think they invented skiing, and they might have, I don't know, but it's debatable because in the Altai Mountains of China, there's archaeologists there also doing ice patch work, and they are looking for skis. And there's this really cool video. I know it's a little arms race there, but there's a really cool video of some traditional skiers, Chinese skiers in the Altai, who were skiing on something that looks very similar to that. Really long wooden skis, and they use just one pole, one really long pole, and they ski down and they kind of use that for direction, and they use skis to hunt and harvest animals. So who's to say? Who's to say where skiing was invented? But it could be the Altai, could be Norway. I guess we'll have to just kind of wait and see who finds the oldest skis in the world. This is a walking stick from the 11th century, and it has runic inscriptions on it, which is super cool. This is, they call it a tang, and it is used to hold down items on a sled. So there were a lot of people traveling through the mountains, and they would go across these ice patches and things would get left behind. They've even found snowshoes for horses, which, so they're putting those on a horse, but snowshoes made out of wood for horses. And then things like this leather shoe, which would have fit a woman or maybe a teenage boy. I wanted to take a step back for a moment because, you know, we've talked a lot about this particular finds you you see in an ice patch, or that archaeologists are finding emerging out of these ice patches. But most of these ice patches are in wilderness areas. You know, a lot of the places that I wrote about in the Age of Melt took place in wilderness areas. And so while overall the Wilderness Act is a good thing, I'm glad that we have it, and I'm glad that we've been able to set aside these huge tracts of land. Where I think it goes wrong, I'm not the one to have this idea, but you know, is that it removes people from the landscape. And so we think of wilderness areas as where, you know, we're untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And it kind of makes me think that it's, you know, it's a mistaken assumption that people weren't in these areas. They're blank slates. And that also, we don't have an influence on these areas. We know that we are, right? So we don't have to just live there to have a direct influence on these places. We are just by living here in these places. And if you live in Denver, if you live in New York City, we're seeing the effects of humanity on, you know, these places that were supposed to be absent of people. The last thing is that it erases indigenous people from the landscape. And when you're talking about wilderness areas in North America, you are talking about, and when you're talking about archaeology in North America, you're talking about indigenous history. So this is their history, and it's not, I hate to even talk about their belongings. I like to think of the artifacts that have come out of North America's ice patches as belongings because their ancestors made them. And so when I spoke to one person in the Yukon, he had gone out and he had surveyed a whole bunch of ice patches, brought back a lot of these artifacts, these belongings. The elders would come and they would touch them all. And in archaeology, that is like, you know, forbidden. You don't touch the artifacts, but they wanted to handle them and see what they were like, interact with them. And one elder said, it's just like my grandpappy used to make. And so like some of these things are young enough that it could have been something that their ancestor made. Like it literally could have been their ancestors' belongings. So just as in Norway, people were hunting reindeer for 6,000-7,000 years. They were also doing very similar hunting strategies for caribou in the Yukon and elsewhere in North America. Their history goes, well, in terms of ice patch archaeology, the oldest artifacts are about 9,000 years old. Their history goes back time immemorial. And we hate to put even, you know, I hate to even put a number on that because every time you turn around, there's some other academic who's saying, you know, oh, I found this older thing, you know, the 20,000-year-old footprints and white sands. And so they say they've been here forever. And I mean, in my mind, they have. And so this landscape belongs to them. This is a representation of how you might hunt caribou on an ice patch. So if the caribou are coming up from below and you're hunting it in the morning and the prevailing winds are headed up the mountain and the caribou are loafing on these ice patches to escape the heat, hunters are coming up from above. And when they miss their target, which happens a lot, the arrow goes right into the ice. So every time you find an arrow in an ice patch, it's a missed opportunity of hunting a caribou or a reindeer, depending on where you are. Just 6 years after Ötzi was discovered, another body was discovered in the corner of British Columbia in a national park by a couple of hunters who were sheep hunting. right away, they knew it wasn't just an ordinary body. I don't know if there's such a thing as an ordinary body when you're out there, but they saw some sticks that they thought might have been an atlatl. It turned out to be an arrow. They found some clothing. They found a spruce hat, and then they also found a body, and that person was embedded in the ice. What's interesting about this is that this body is, he was only about 250 years old, so he was alive not all that long ago. So the Champagne and Asiatic First Nations, whose traditional lands he was found on, began scouring their archives to see if they could figure out exactly who this person was. They didn't end up doing that, but one day maybe oral histories might reveal a little bit about this person and who he was, because they have a ton of stories about glacier travel, when to go across the glacier, when not to go across the glacier. They have stories about people who have fallen into crevasses and died, others who fell into crevasses and survived and then were rescued by others who came to search for them. So they have a rich cultural history that's tied to glaciers, but the whole community got together. It was really fortuitous when he was found in 1997 because the government, the First Nations government, had just gotten co-management rights for the national park, and including all exclusive naming rights. So if it had been, this body had been found a few years even earlier, British Columbia government might have taken control of the body, did what they wanted to, all the studies that they wanted to, the First Nations might have had no chance, really to have a say in what happens to this body, because they felt strongly this was their ancestor and he needed to be treated like their ancestor. But they also recognized the importance of studying him for science and for their own culture too. There was a ton they learned from him. So they decided, well, we will give scientists 2 years to come up with proposals and study different aspects of this man, but we're going to decide who gets the proposals and what is exactly studied. And based on what they learned, they were able to put together a history of his last days of life, which is pretty remarkable. There were a few things that they weren't willing to concede, like he had been found with what they think is a medicine bag, and medicine bags are very sacred and the contents are only supposed to be known by the owner. And so they refused to let anyone look inside. So we'll never know what was inside. And so in the end, after the 2 years, they took his remains and all of his belongings, some of them they reserved, and cremated him. They put him in this beautiful wooden box and they put him out back on the landscape and where he was found. I actually think that's a really beautiful story, and it's also very different from Ötzi. Ötzi is in a museum, and you can go and visit him in Bolzano, Italy. And I did, I went and saw him, and I thought it was just, I'd seen so many pictures of Ötzi as this dead man. I didn't realize when I got there to the museum, like how moving it would be to see like an actual person. This was a human being. And even though he was alive 5,300 years ago, like he still had, I could just feel his humanity. And this is why I show this picture of this book. This is the book that they had, several First Nations had gotten together and written along with scientists to take ownership of and tell their own story. And so you won't find pictures of the body on the internet. They just don't exist because they didn't feel that that was right. They didn't feel that that was the right thing to do. It's like, so while, there's this huge assemblage of archaeological artifacts emerging from ice patches, it's only part of the story. How do you talk about the less tangible aspects of the relationship between people and alpine environments? I had the opportunity to go to the spiritual pilgrimage in just outside of Cusco in Peru. It is called Coyuridi, and it describes the visual phenomenon of Venus rising in the night sky as the first visible star right on top of the glacier. And this star planet appears to rest upon the glacier for just a moment, and then it continues rising in the night sky. So the festival, as it's practiced today, is kind of a merging of Catholicism and the ancient Quechuan religion of the people who are indigenous to the high Andes. Although we call it, the scientists, anthropologists call it a syncretic merging of these religions. It really is, you know, the Catholics trying to take over and suppressing what the indigenous people of the Andes believed. But because of the Andes, you know, it looks like this, it's a rugged landscape. There's lots of small communities. They had a really hard time suppressing them, and they were just not having it. And so they decided, the Catholics decided, well, we better kind of make this merging of these two, you know, sneak in our Catholic elements into this festival that's already in existence. So there's a story of how this festival came to be. In this high mountain valley, a boy who herded alpacas was fighting with his brother, got really upset and angry, and stomped off with his small herd of alpaca and sheep and climbed into the head of the valley. And there he met a small blonde-haired boy, which is the representation of Jesus. They played together, and as they were playing together in the mountains, the alpacas grew really fat, super woolly and happy, and his father eventually came up the valley to check on him because he'd been gone for weeks at this point, and saw that his herd had grown. And so he wanted to reward the boys by giving them new clothes, as you do. So he took a small piece of fabric from this blonde-haired boy. It turns out that that piece of fabric was apparently worn only by bishops. And so the bishop got really angry and thought, well, he must have stolen it. And so he took a bunch of other people armed, and they went up to the valley to try to capture this boy and question him. Well, when they tried to capture him, he disappeared into a black rock, and all that was left was this big black rock. So now there's this whole like religious festival that's somewhat centered around this black rock. And to avoid like this sort of like just worshiping of this black rock, they imbued it with like, this is Jesus here. This is Jesus's spirit went into this black rock. So the pilgrimage starts at about 13,000 feet at a church, and you can give offerings there. It travels for about 5 miles along a paved, or not a paved, but a dirt path. And all along the way are these crosses, and people stop at each of 12 crosses and pay their respects and give offerings there. They had built a church up about 16,000 feet in elevation that houses the black rock. And here it is here behind a window. And the people that come up there from all over the Andes, from the rainforest, from other parts of the Andes, from different countries, Bolivia, they all come to pay their respects. And they wait for hours sometimes outside of this church to go inside and see. And then they come out, and then on the other side of that, there's just a lot of singing and dancing. It's really quite beautiful. The year we went was just a little bit after COVID, and they weren't quite at full capacity, but to me, there were still quite a few people there. Last night of this 3-day festival, a select few of the pilgrims will hike to the foot of the glaciers, and they spend the night there, the whole night. And it is cold. They're at like 16,000, above 16,000 feet, and they spend the night there. We were 1,000 or 1,500 feet lower, freezing to death. It felt like, in our super comfy, warm down bags and tents. So I can't imagine what it must have been like for them, but it's a rite of passage. It allows them to kind of be leaders in this Quechuan festival. Come down the next morning, and they bring a cross that had been brought up to the glaciers, and they bring it down, and then the bishops bless them, and there's lots of singing and dancing. I just want to point out here the gorgeous colors of all of their clothing. So each of the Quechuan nations make these gorgeous beaded like panels that they wear, and their clothing tells the story of their particular culture. And so some of them will have come from the rainforest and be, think that, some of the tropical birds have spiritual properties. And so they come up to the mountains and from all over the place, and there's lots of singing and dancing. And the neat thing is that the Quechuan people are really taking back this, and they're rebelling kind of against this Catholic like infusion into their religion and taking it back. And you can see it here in just the clothing that they wear and the singing and the dancing. So, there are mountain pilgrimages all over the world including possibly one close to home in the Wind River Range. And I was able to go on, in the same year, I was able to go with Todd Gunther, who is a anthropology and archaeology professor at Central Wyoming College in Lander. He's since retired, but he's still very involved with his students. So he allowed me to tag along with a couple of his archaeology students to kind of go and look at this and see potentially ancient pilgrimage to see the glaciers and the winds. We spent most of our time above tree line. What they found is a bunch of these rock cairns. And so it's really hard, dating rock. You can't really, I mean, you can sort of, but not really. It's hard to know, like, did someone put this there recently, or is this an ancient cairn? When they at first they thought, well, it's just probably someone had built this, but they kept finding them along this 12-mile route where there was one cairn that would lead the eye to another one, and then another one, and another one over 12 miles. And some of them had these unique rock windows. And so they thought, well, that's unusual. Okay, so let's look through that. Well, it points right at a glacier. And they thought, well, maybe that's just coincidence. But they kept finding them over and over again. And there would be a tall rock cairn, and then interspersed throughout this trail were these windows built out of rock that pointed directly at a glacier. And so after a few of these, they thought, this can't be coincidence. And then they looked back, they stopped and they looked back at the landscape they had just come over, and they could see this pathway, this swale in the landscape that wasn't created by animals. It wasn't created, by anything modern. It looked like hundreds, thousands of people had tramped through this ground at some point in the past. And so was this a pilgrimage, much like the Coyuriti was a pilgrimage here? They're still investigating that, but the evidence seems to suggest that there was, and why not? They knew that glaciers are the lifeblood. They relied on these glaciers and meltwater. So I just want to read just one last thing. There are people today who carry bits of Ötzi's DNA in their own, passed down from one generation to the next over many thousands of years. For all I know, given my European lineage, Ötzi could be one of my ancestors, although I doubt it. I wonder what he would have wanted for his descendants. He probably would have wanted a good harvest, for the snow to accumulate high in the mountains during winter, and for that snow to melt slowly throughout the following summer to ensure healthy crops. He probably would have also wished for good health and prosperity for the next generation, and the generation after that, and so on. As a farmer, he would have been keenly aware of the relationship between how much snow fell in the mountains the previous winter and the size and health of the harvest the following autumn. He would have seen grain grow thick in wet, but not too wet years, and wither in years of drought. His life and livelihood depended on noticing changes in the environment and adapting to those changes. Some of those adaptations included clearing forests for crops and livestock. Livestock changed the plant communities where they grazed. He and his contemporaries probably diverted streams to water agricultural fields. We've inherited the world he and his contemporaries helped shape. Although Neolithic farmers influenced how the landscape looked, their footprint was relatively minor compared to the one we leave today. If we could go back to Ötzi's time and see the world as he saw it, I think we'd mourn much more viscerally for the loss of what once was. The discovery of Ötzi's remains not only inspired a new way of looking at the mountains. In fact, this one mummy and all the ice patch artifacts that would follow signals something else. The ice is melting. The glaciers that Ötzi was familiar with are actively disappearing, and it is not a natural change. And if we let glaciers disappear entirely, we will leave a far diminished world for those who come after us. Ötzi encourages us to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to leave for our descendants? What will our legacy be?
What are you working on now?
I am I'm working for an organization called the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture, doing communications for them. And so it's an organization of public-private partnership that helps manage grasslands in the Northern Great Plains for the benefit of birds, the rural communities who depend on them. We want to keep grass and grass. Don't want it to plow it. So yeah, I decided my original goal was to, after writing this book, was to become a full-time freelance person, writer. And I decided, gosh, that is a lot of work. I think I just want a job. Job that's 9 to 5. Because writing a book is one of those things that it's not just a job, it's like it consumes you and it consumes your family and stuff. So now I work 9 to 5, still work a lot, but it's a little more manageable, I think. But it's fun, I love it. Maybe I'll write a book about birds next, grassland birds.
At least with the movement of the glaciers constantly flowing downhill, is there any like feeling of how much is being lost in there? Do they find enough in the glaciers still to say like, yeah, these areas were inhabited, or is it just all ground up so much that the ice patches are the only spot that they're really looking for anything?
Yeah, the ice patches are the only spot that they're really looking for anything. It's not that things don't can sometimes emerge from glaciers. A lot of World War II plains and some things that are more durable have emerged from the Alps. But in terms of ice patch archaeology, not too much. So they're really focused on ice patches. And also it's the nature of the ice patches too, because glaciers are hard to travel across and get to, mountain glaciers, you know, and so they're not, in terms of hunting at least, they're not really easy places to go hunt. Whereas an ice patch is kind of on this shallow, you know, slope that's can still be quite steep, but it's a little bit more navigable. And so the hunters, you know, come up around the backside and are able to hunt caribou, reindeer, sheep here. They're hunting sheep here, bison, other animals that were up on those ice patches.
What forms the ice patches, the glaciers?
No, that's a great question. So ice patches are distinct bodies of ice that have always been ice patches. If they had been glaciers in the past, it's not that they couldn't have been glaciers in the past, but more than likely, these ice patches with artifacts were always ice patches. If they had been glaciers at one point, they would have crushed and destroyed the things within them. So these bodies of ice have been there for, you know, 10,000 plus years. And the way that they form and are able to stay, scientists think, is that there's a lot of wind in these high alpine environments. And so a lot of the snow accumulation on these ice patches is due to wind drift alone. They can, I mean, tens of feet in a single year just by wind drift. So it's not even that it's direct snow falling onto these ice patches. It's just accumulation of wind, and they are located in these areas in the landscape that the snow, wind carries the snow and it deposits it right on top.
I produced a video about a year ago called The Last Cold. And it's not about miracle cure for the last virus. It is the loss of cold in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And if you'll go to our YouTube channel called Gathering a Naturalist, you can look at it there. And I've been fortunate to work with the high altitude all around the ecosystem. And it's got a lot of the facts involved in the loss of glaciers and ice fields here. And in 1955, we started, Dwight Billings, Phil Johnson started studying snowfields in the Beartooths. And we have the snowfields they started with. Phil was the graduate student, and he would go around the edge every week and mark the edge of the snowfield with fingernail polish. And when I got up here, I started monitoring the same snowfields, plus a couple others, one called the Snowberg snowfield and one called the Maze. And these were huge, deep snowfields. And we wandered around at some point in time inside the snowfields, and the tunnels had melted out. And Bill was with me on that. And don't spot anybody else in the room that was with me on those. 2014, Bill and I were deep in the snowfields with 15-foot tunnel passages through. In 2015, they were gone. And we collected bison skulls there, which we've got to get off to radiocarbon dating. That I expect will be thousands of years old. Many of you know Jim Gary, who's a mythologist, oral traditionist. He knows of no Native American stories in the area of bison up there above tree line, and certainly no white man stories. So it'll be interesting to see what we get on this skull, which hope to get sent out. But we found 4 sets of bones under the Snow Maze snowfield, and it was probably only 2 bison, though the bones just scattered out by that. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of date we've got there. And the last one is the Snowberg snowfield,
Glacial ice, we generally figure when it's compressed to 70% water, 30% air, that we can start calling it glacial ice. If it hasn't been created by water percolating into the snowfield, water percolating in can make it quite dense. So the Snowberg ice field, Snowberg snowbank, calves off snowbergs when I was first here. And we would have snowbergs floating around, not icebergs, because it wasn't quite dense enough. And this past summer, it was gone. It died. So some pretty sad spots there, but I would encourage you to look up the last cold in our Gathering a Naturalist page and see what's there on the cold that's been lost in this ecosystem. A lot of phenomena that most people don't know about, like the ice caves under the Tetons, and which melted out, and the ice caves in the Pryor Mountains, and some pretty neat stuff. Climate is changing. But now for the commercial. Lisa hasn't said anything, but I'll say something. Lisa has a book that is for sale that talks about much of this stuff. Not only that, I have connections with the author. I can get him autographed for you.
Thank you for joining us for this program. If you like the program, we have a channel on YouTube. Go to YouTube and search for Gathering a Naturalist. You may also visit our website at tracknature.com, where you'll find our books, classes, and other products. Our books are available on Amazon.com. And this is Jim Halfpenny. Take care, my friends.